I'm wondering how this quote relates to the protagonist's dilemma. It's from George Bernard Shaw. The moment we want to believe something, we suddenly see all arguments for it and we become blind to the arguments against it.
Can you read it again?
Sure. George Bernard Shaw, the moment we want to believe something, we suddenly see all arguments for it and become blind to all arguments against it.
Such a great quote, and I think that speaks in some part to why writers write, because our job is to play both sides of the argument with equal integrity. So in spite of the fact that I don't believe this thing, story isn't about, it's not binary. It's not do I believe it or do I not believe it. Story is about taking, Einstein says genius is the ability to hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously. And so that's really what a storyteller is doing, is taking these two seemingly disparate ideas and watching them collide in order to arrive at a deeper truth. And so there's an exercise I do with my writers. I call it the credo exercise. And the exercise is this. One thing I feel strongly about is, and it's not from the point of view of your protagonist, it's from the point of view of the author. And so I have them write for 5 minutes. One thing I feel strongly about is, and then what I have them do is I take what you just wrote and frame it as one single arguable statement. For example, I feel strongly that everyone should be treated equally. All right? So then you take that statement, and now I want you to find an opposing argument to that statement. Okay? And so, well, I think everyone should be treated equally, except what about terrible criminals, for example? What about people who have done terrible crime? Should they be treated equally? And so now you've got the beginning of an interesting story. In other words, the credo exercise helps you connect to the antagonistic forces in your story. Not your antagonists, not your characters, but you start to see how the more you start to explore these antagonistic forces, the more you begin to recognize that your job as a storyteller is exploring that Shaw quote that you just read, which is, the job of the storyteller is to play both sides with equal integrity. So in spite of the fact that I believe that everyone should be treated equally, let me explore that question through an antagonistic force, or through a character who should not be treated equally. So like, you think about that, I don't know why it jumped in my head, but that movie with Sean Penn and Susan Sarandon, Dead Man Walking. So this is about a man who's on death row for committing a terrible crime, and Susan Sarandon. And so you can see that question, should this character be treated equally? And Susan Sarandon, this is a true story, and she played the nun, I can't remember the nun's name, but she comes in with compassion and humanity, and he is so sort of entrenched, he's so sort of, he's got so much sort of emotional scar tissue that he's not willing to really confess to his crime. And the whole journey, the whole story is about these two human beings coming together in order to arrive at a deeper truth, which is that perhaps the only way he will be able to die a free man, because he's on death row, is by taking responsibility for his crime.
I'd been watching the movie The Help, and then started reading or listening to the audiobook, which is much more detailed. And in that sense, it's a different look at, you know, the antagonist, which is a whole town and a whole society that thought there should be separate bathrooms, and that trying to, under the guise of doing the right thing, we're gonna get this initiative so that we can have these special bathrooms for all the help. And not really sure where I'm going with it, but It's I know you're probably asking me that.
I'm enjoying this.
But it's so fascinating to hear the voices of these characters because I'm listening to the audio book. So each one, it's played by, I think, a different actress each time reading it, the part. And then the one woman who sort of crosses the boundary lines, which, again, I know there were some pushback against the story because they felt it was trivialized. That's its own separate issue, and maybe in some parts it definitely is. But that the one person who sort of crosses these lines is the journalist who wants to write about these women and sort of share this story.
The one thing I think that is so instructive about that is that is the author's name Catherine Stockett?
Yes, it is.
And this might be apocryphal, but I heard she sent that book out to like over 100 agents or publishers before or maybe she had an agent, but it went out to everybody passed on it. And I think it's a real lesson in perseverance that sometimes the universe tests us, and that we have to believe in the thing that we've created in order for it to find its home. And I was really fascinated by that story, how she stayed with it.
Why is it so important for a writer to understand dilemma?
The dilemma is the source of your story. Dilemma is how your theme gets dramatized. And every writing book I ever read talked about the dramatic question. And I always got stuck when I thought in terms of, or the dramatic problem. Because when you think in terms of problem, you think in terms of solving the problem. We solve intellectually. And as I said, Einstein says you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created the problem. So we get stuck. But when you start to recognize that your protagonist doesn't have a problem, but they have a dilemma, which is a problem that can't be solved without creating another problem, the story starts to open up in a way that you might not have previously imagined. Because a dilemma is an experience. A problem is intellectual, but a dilemma is an experience. And when you think in terms of dilemma, you let go of the idea that there's any way to solve this. You can't solve a problem. You can't solve a dilemma. You can only resolve it through a shift in perception. And so a dilemma, when a protagonist is struggling with a dilemma, they are going to be forced to let go of the meaning they made out of their goal in order to begin to pursue what they need as opposed to what they want. Because I can never solve this dilemma based on my, as Einstein says, based on my current approach. So dilemma is the source of your story.
And is that where the dark night of the soul comes in?
Yeah, the dark night of the soul is where the dilemma becomes apparent to your protagonist. I don't necessarily mean that the protagonist goes, I'm struggling with a dilemma right now. But the dark night of the soul is where your protagonist experiences some kind of cry into the void, where they go, I'm all alone, or I have failed. It's where your protagonist recognizes the impossibility of getting what they want, as opposed to the difficulty. It's not difficult, it's literally impossible based on my current approach, causing me, because the only way the phoenix can rise from the ashes is after it's died. Okay, so story isn't about will your protagonist get what they want. Story is about will your protagonist die to their old identity or their old idea of the meaning they made out of their goal, so they can begin to pursue what they need. And in pursuing what they need, then it becomes possible to get what they want if what they want belongs in their life. Because sometimes what we want doesn't belong in our life. And when we finally let it go, we're able to have something that does belong in our life, something that's actually going to be satisfying.